Thank you to the organizers for asking me to speak today on Bitcoin for doctors. I realize this is not a common topic that we discuss at surgical and medical conferences, but in reality, it's pretty difficult these days to run a conference with a technological innovation focus without at least touching on what is arguably the most disruptive technological development since the invention of the internet, and that is blockchain more broadly and Bitcoin more specifically. So probably a good idea to get some of the boring stuff out of the way first, and we'll start by defining some terms. So cryptography is not a new concept. This is the Lorentz cipher machine, which was used in World War II to encrypt communications of the German High Command. And cryptography is this. It's encryption of communication. The blockchain is a newer concept, and this represents a continuously growing list of records, which are called blocks, on the web, and these are secured using cryptography. And this is essentially a secure cryptographic ledger of transactions. Cryptocurrencies, or crypto assets as they're more appropriately called, are digital tokens on the blockchain that can be exchanged peer-to-peer through a computer network. Bitcoin represents the first and most decentralized of these crypto assets, with a fundamental unique property of fixed supply and issuance, and we'll go into in detail why that's important. Altcoins are crypto assets other than Bitcoin, and they have different properties. Most of these act like shares in a company. And Web 3.0 is the next generation of the internet, which the promise of which is that it's going to be built in a decentralized way using crypto technology. So it's estimated that it takes somewhere between 100 and 1,000 hours of study to really understand Bitcoin deeply. And so I'll do the best I can to try and capture it in this 30-minute talk. But if I could summarize Bitcoin in one line, I would say that it is an elegant technological solution to a very serious global societal problem. So what is that problem? Well, stated simply, the problem is that the entire world economy is completely and objectively bankrupt to the tune of about $60 trillion and growing. What's interesting about this chart here is that all of the countries are in debt, including the ones in green, just to a greater or lesser extent. So if all countries in the world are in debt to greater or lesser extent, then who are we in debt to? It took me a very long time to understand this because it is shrouded in complicated words like quantitative easing and the Federal Reserve Bank and the issuance of government bonds. But it turns out that we aren't borrowing between countries. We aren't borrowing from each other. We are simply borrowing from our own future. And the way governments do this is they issue something called a government bond, which is essentially give me your money and I promise to pay it back down the road. But this basically never happens, and successive governments just continually kick the can down the road in an ever-accelerating and increasing debt spiral. And it's at the point now where the debt burden is so massive that it is impossible to pay it back, and in fact, it is unlikely to ever be paid back. So how did this happen? How did we reach this point of escape velocity where the interest payments on the debt are far higher than the world GDP itself? Well, if you look back through charts of things like government debt and economic output, it looks like something fundamentally broke in 1971 and the wheels really well and truly came off and the whole system just started spiraling out of control. So when you look at world events around 1971, it becomes clear that one of the fundamental reasons why the system began to break is that the US dollar was unpegged from gold. After World War II, the world financial system was reorganized around the US dollar as the reserve currency under something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. Back then, the US dollar had to be backed by gold. So for each dollar that the Reserve Bank had, they had to have an equivalent amount of gold to back this IOU. And therefore, all world currencies were also pegged to gold through the US dollar. That is until Richard Nixon in 1971 unpegged the US dollar from gold and broke that link. And so instead of the US dollar being backed by gold, it was therefore backed by nothing other than promises since 1971. And so because it became unpegged from gold, money printing essentially became free. So you could just add a zero and create more money without having to purchase an equivalent amount of gold. And so since 1971, the rate of money printing has been accelerating to a ridiculously unsustainable rate. And it's important to mention that this is independent of which government was in power. So whether you had a right-wing or left-wing government, it made no difference. And in fact, it's independent of which country you're in, because it's happening in every country every year since 1971. And this relatively free money printing corresponds with the collapse in the purchasing power of the US dollar, because as you increase the amount of dollars in circulation, the value of each individual dollar goes down by that amount. And over a longer time frame, it's pretty dramatic. So the US dollar, which is the strongest world reserve currency, has collapsed by a factor of 10 since 1971. And if we look at the situation in Australia, I mean, we tend to think we're somewhat disconnected from these things, but we're absolutely not. This graph shows the growth in the money supply, which is what M3 is, of the Australian dollar. And you can see that, even since 1997, the amount of Australian dollars in circulation, printed money, has increased somewhere between 5 and 15% every single year. And of course, just like with the US dollar, with every printed Australian dollar in circulation, the value of this dollar goes down because the currency is being debased. And this has all sorts of unintended consequences. One example for this is the astronomical increase in house prices, which is in large part due to the debasement of the Australian dollar rather than any sort of supply and demand dynamics. And we know this because there is a corresponding increase in price in other asset classes, for example, shares. This graph shows the share prices of the ASX, the Australian Stock Exchange, over time in comparison with other international stock markets. And you can see that the price goes up corresponding to the money printing, independent of the characteristics of the individual economies. Similarly, the price of commodities like oil and gas also go up by a corresponding amount. And there's a popular misconception that the price of goods and services is a reflection of supply and demand. Traditionally, that was the case, but is no longer the case in the modern era. This can of Coke is a very simple example of this. This costs approximately $3 to $4 in Australia now. When I was growing up 30 years ago, it cost 30 cents. So the price of a can of Coca-Cola has gone up by a factor of 10 over 30 years. But the demand has not gone up by a factor of 10, and the supply has not reduced by a factor of 10. All that's happened is that the value of the Australian dollar has collapsed by a factor of 10. Unfortunately for us, though, not all asset price inflation is considered equal. And what we notice here is that when the money supply is debased, what in fact happens is that the price of assets that are hard to create or make more of goes up exponentially more. And the sharp end of the stick at the top of the graph there is hospital services, because it is extremely difficult to expand hospital services. And so the inflation in price of hospital services goes up relatively more than even something like houses, and certainly much more than CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, for household goods and services. And as healthcare providers, we feel this every day. It is the main explanation for why, although we spend more and more on healthcare every year, this chart is fairly linear. So we increase the amount we spend by a fixed amount every year, roughly. But the inflation in the price of these services goes up exponentially due to money printing. And so it's almost like running uphill, and the hill just keeps getting steeper as you're running up it, because the expenditure on healthcare cannot possibly keep up with the inflation in healthcare prices. And so essentially we're spending more but getting less for our money, which explains why there are no more hospital beds despite increased expenditure, why hospital ambulance ramping is getting worse despite increased expenditure, and why elective surgical waiting lists keep getting longer despite increased expenditure. We just simply cannot keep up with how much these things cost now. So I think it's pretty clear that the money is broken and that it needs to be fixed. Before we get on to why Bitcoin might be one possible solution to this problem, I think it's important to go over what the properties of good, sound money actually are. The first is that money really should be scarce and incorruptible. It should be the most scarce asset to function properly. Funnily enough, gold used to have these properties, which is why it was traditionally used as a reserve currency, but cash never did. The reason cash was used, however, is because gold is not easy to divide divide and move around. And so cash was seen as an IOU for the gold that you had in storage, because it was easier to divide up the cash and to move it around between various jurisdictions. So cash does have some positive qualities that could possibly be emulated. I think good money must have fixed issuance and supply, so the inflation rate needs to be predictable and not determined by unelected officials and variable at different times of the year and in different years. It would be helpful if the distribution of this new money was fair. One of the main issues with cash and the way it is distributed is that the distribution is not fair. It's not equitable, and it's not based on work and effort. It's based on who controls the keys to printing more money. We tend to think of cash as being acceptable worldwide, but that's actually not true. So for example, I can't go to Zimbabwe and spend Australian dollars. If I wanted to go to Zimbabwe and spend Australian dollars, I have to go through multiple intermediaries like banks and foreign exchange services. I have to convert one type of cash to another. And that's an inefficient process and also very expensive because each one of these intermediaries takes a cut. And in the modern age, it shouldn't be that difficult. It should be easy to transact globally without the need to convert from one asset class to another. So I think those properties are fairly simple, and in the electronic age should be fairly simple to solve. But in fact, this hasn't been done. It wasn't until Bitcoin was discovered or invented in 2009 and was essentially engineered to tick all the boxes and be perfect money. Bitcoin is essentially just open source code that was released by probably a group of developers into the world in January 2009. And this was in response to the gross bank bailout that happened at the time of the GFC. Because it became clear that no matter how corrupt the system became and no matter how failing the financial system was, the banks, who are the source of a lot of this, will always be bailed out by governments using taxpayer money. And so it was sort of a political statement, but it was also a technical solution to that problem, and it was released on that basis. And essentially what Bitcoin does is it replicates the dynamics of scarce money in a virtual way. And therefore it's been called the Internet of Money. So if you can think of, for example, how photographs and music has been digitized from physical media to electronic media. So now we look at photos on the internet, not on physical photos, and that has advantages. Bitcoin does the same for gold. So it's a virtual version of gold and pretty much better than gold in every way. It relies on three main components: blockchain, which we discussed at the beginning. Essentially, that's just a public electronic ledger of all the Bitcoin transactions that's visible for anyone to see. Nodes, which are lightweight computers that validate these transactions and ensure that they are secure. And miners, that are much more powerful computers that are able to generate or discover Bitcoin at a fixed rate. And I'll go through these components briefly in the next few slides. So again, nodes are responsible for verifying transactions. So Bitcoin transactions are simply Bitcoin sent from person to person, and the nodes are responsible for making sure that those transactions are valid and secure. Nodes do not mine or discover or produce Bitcoin. All they do is observe the transactions and make sure that they're fair and correct. Anyone can run a node at home because the software used to run a node is extremely lightweight. And in fact, I'm running a node right now. This is a screenshot of my node running in the background while I'm doing this talk on this very computer. And it's important that these nodes are lightweight because you want a lot of people running a lot of different nodes because you want a highly decentralized network. As a result of how many nodes are currently running simultaneously, the Bitcoin node network is considered the single most powerful and secure computer network in the world. Each node stores a historical copy of every Bitcoin transaction, and this network has been completely incorruptible despite multiple hacking attempts by extremely high-powered hackers over the past 13 years. Because it's almost impossible to hack simultaneously all of the nodes at once, and I'll show you why in a second. This is a live photo of all the current Bitcoin nodes in operation. At the time of writing this talk, there were about 15,000 nodes that were running simultaneously, each with a complete copy of the Bitcoin transactions since 2009. And in order to corrupt the network, you would have to hack all of these computers simultaneously, which is basically impossible. Bitcoin miners are a little bit different. Bitcoin miners are responsible for the issuance of Bitcoin. And their main job really is to make sure that the generation of Bitcoin is allocated fairly based on the amount of work that is done to find the Bitcoin. And this concept that's called proof of work. And it relies on the idea that you can't really have good, strong, sound money without energy use, because the best way to allocate resources is based on the amount of energy used to get those resources at baseline. It's also important to note that energy is what makes the Bitcoin hard to get, hard to discover, and impossible to simply print out of thin air like we do these days with cash. So if you accept that energy is essential to the creation of sound money, well, then you look at, well, how do I make a system that rewards energy use in the most efficient way possible? And it turns out that in 2022, the most efficient machines that exist in the world are gaming computers. Because what gaming computers do is they convert electricity into knowledge, into data. And they do that by definition in the most efficient way possible because they're competing against other Bitcoin computers to continually improve how powerful they are with as little electricity use as possible. So miners leverage this ability to produce Bitcoin. Except to say that there is a fixed supply of Bitcoin. It'll only ever be 21 million. And the issuance rate, the amount of Bitcoin that are released, is also fixed and goes down with time. And so all of these powerful gaming computers are basically competing to solve complex puzzles in order to get the Bitcoin out of the ground, so to speak. And they're rewarded based on the amount of energy they use and the amount of time they spend. And in fact, that is from basic principles, an extremely fair way to reward people or to allocate value, which is a combination of the energy that's spent and the time that's spent. It's a very pure way to determine the value of something. And I think that's a very powerful concept that currently doesn't exist in our monetary system as far as how the money is generated. And so it's a dramatic improvement in that regard. So as we discussed, there will only be 21 million Bitcoin. The first Bitcoin was mined in 2009, and the last Bitcoin that will ever be created will be mined in 2140, with a decreasing rate of issuance between now and then. The way this is achieved is somewhat complex, but basically every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that is released per day halves, up until no more Bitcoin is released in 2140. We're currently at the 6.25 block, and so we've had 3 halvings, and so currently 6.25 Bitcoin are issued per block. And what's important to mention here is no matter how many miners are created, that doesn't matter. They compete for the same amount of Bitcoin. So the more miners there are and the more energy that's used, the less Bitcoin each miner will get. Conversely, if there are less miners, then each miner will be rewarded more for the effort that they spend. But the point is that the amount of Bitcoin produced is fixed, regardless of the amount of energy spent to mine it. And this is reflected in this chart. This is the chart of Bitcoin issuance. So in orange or red there, you see the amount of Bitcoin in circulation, and you can see that the curve tops out around 2140. But in fact, most of the Bitcoin's already been mined even today. More than half of it has. And in blue is the rate of inflation. So every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin inflation drops by half. And this will eventually become zero. So effectively, Bitcoin has an understood inflation rate, and that inflation rate drops predictably with time, therefore creating the most scarce asset in existence and an excellent frame of reference to compare value to of other commodities and services. So if we go back to this table, looking at the properties of good money, you can see that Bitcoin ticks every single box, and it was designed from the outset to do that, to create perfect money, technically perfect money. But it's become a little bit more than that. So the top 2 circles of the Venn diagram are self-explanatory. So Bitcoin is at the transaction of technology and money. But there is this other element, the element of personal sovereignty, because you no longer require governments or banks on a Bitcoin standard, because you can control your own Bitcoin. You don't need a bank to store it, and you can transact with anybody in the world without permission. And that's a very powerful concept, representing the separation of money and state. And it's something that's not really been possible before until Bitcoin came about, which is an interesting element as well. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is an interesting idea. I understand the concept and understand how it might be an improvement on what we currently have, but I just can't see it becoming adopted as the world's reserve currency or the world's money. But I think that's because we are very early in the story of Bitcoin. We've been in this sort of situation before. This newspaper headline was from December 2000. It's sort of hard to believe that, only a short 22 years ago, people were still wondering whether this internet thing was going to be important in our lives or not. And it may well be that Bitcoin is on the same path because it does represent the same type of disruptive technology. It's just a bit hard to see this far out how revolutionary it could very well be. And if you look at Bitcoin's adoption curve, it is emblematic of pretty much all major technological adoptions. We are very early in the adoption curve, but it is increasing exponentially. And it is not very far-fetched to think that within 20 to 30 years, Bitcoin will live on your wallet and you won't even think twice about it. So that's the technological story of Bitcoin, an early tech with promising ideas and promising properties. But there is another element, and this goes hand in hand with the personal sovereignty element. All world reserve currencies have a limited lifespan, and I think it would be hard to argue that the US dollar as the reserve currency has not already passed its peak. In fact, the US dollar is facing serious competition from other world currencies, in particular the Chinese digital yuan, which was launched last year, and is aiming to compete head-to-head with the US dollar for world reserve status. And so many of us who are interested in this aspect of Bitcoin feel that there's going to be a choice to be made in the next few years. Does the world transition to the next country's superpower's money or currency? Or do we aim for a superior solution that is actually independent of government politics and relies on math and energy and science rather than geopolitical competition for supremacy and for utilization? So this is all very interesting in theory, but why should you, as a doctor or a healthcare worker, why should you care about this? Well, for two really quite fundamental reasons. One is your personal finances and wealth, and the other is the healthcare costs that we touched on before. One of the saddest aspects of the failing monetary system we find ourselves in today is something called the Cantillon effect. The Cantillon effect is an economic principle which basically states that those that are closest to the money printer stand to benefit preferentially. And it is the explanation as to why all our high-rise buildings have banks' names on them rather than the names of other companies and institutions. Bankers, politicians, and property speculators, including real estate agents, get ahead in the current system because they are the closest to the money printer, whereas doctors, teachers, and nurses, arguably better qualified professionals and in more noble professions, get, relatively speaking, left behind. And it's a similar story with healthcare expenditure. The fundamental reason why healthcare expenditure does not keep up with healthcare price inflation is exactly the same problem. By the time the healthcare dollar gets to us, gets to the hospitals, the cream has been removed from the top by bankers, politicians, and property speculators. So we get the crumbs, and the crumbs are simply not enough. And this fact is not lost on the Bitcoin community. In fact, there have been multiple op-eds written about what would happen to the healthcare system, how it could improve if the money supply was not falling from top down and in fact was distributed from the middle in proportion to need and in proportion to effort, and so rewarding what we would regard as valuable rather than rewarding what is closest, physically speaking, to the money printer. It's hard to argue that healthcare expenditure wouldn't be better under a Bitcoin standard, and many of us hope that this would be the case down the line once the money is separated and improved upon from what it is now. So if you are interested in learning more, I think it's really important to educate yourself about Bitcoin, even if you don't believe some of the things that you've heard today. I think it's important that you read multiple sources of information, including from mainstream media, but also from independent sources, to try and just understand the technology and what promise it may hold for the future. You never know, it could just take off. If you are interested, I would also consider saving in Bitcoin. I'm obviously a hardcore Bitcoin maxi, and I put 5% of every paycheck that I get, I convert it immediately to Bitcoin, and I put it in a wallet and I forget about it. It's important to hold the Bitcoin yourself, not to leave it on exchanges. And it's also important not to worry necessarily about the price of Bitcoin. So, don't try and buy large amounts. Buy small amounts regularly at any price. We are still very early in the adoption, and because of that, the price fluctuates wildly. It tends to go up on a 4-yearly basis. So if you buy small amounts regularly and you wait, generally speaking, the price is not such a big issue. And I think in the future, it will become a non-issue. So with that, I'll address a couple of questions that I always get. What if the government bans Bitcoin? I'm here to tell you that that's not going to happen. And the reason I think that's not going to happen is because this Bitcoin thing represents such a major threat to governments worldwide that if they could have banned it by now, it would have been banned. And in fact, several more authoritarian governments have attempted to ban Bitcoin, and they've been very unsuccessful because it is such a decentralized, autonomous network, and therefore it is not really possible for any one government to ban it. The energy use argument is also often put forward, that Bitcoin wastes energy or harms the environment. That's simply a moot point, in my opinion, because the problem that Bitcoin is attempting to solve, the problem of fake money, mandates energy use. And in fact, because of the use of gaming computers and often cheap renewable energy, Bitcoin is much more efficient than any system that it is trying to replace by orders of magnitude. So in my opinion, moving to a Bitcoin standard will be a dramatic improvement in the amount of energy required to run a monetary system and the amount of harm caused to the environment. And at the end of the day, it's fundamental to the design of the thing. I think if you removed energy use from Bitcoin, then it would no longer be Bitcoin. It would be yet another printable fiat type currency, and so it wouldn't solve the problem that we have today. So what about other cryptocurrencies and Web 3.0? I'm much less excited about these. I think they represent a fundamentally different proposition to what Bitcoin is. You may have heard about some of these, like Ethereum and Cardano and Polkadot. They basically represent other uses for the blockchain technology system. They can do things like digital identification and copyright and intellectual property and various other financial type endeavors. But they are very risky as an investment, and they are not really decentralized. Most of these cryptos and crypto tokens have founders and foundations and companies running them. So I tend to think about them like when you buy the token, it's like buying shares in an extremely early, nascent tech startup without any serious regulation to control it. And so while some of these companies may well become very profitable and may become the next Facebook and Google, they could also go to zero overnight. And that's actually happened in many, many instances. So unless you have a professional level trader type understanding of these technologies, I would stay away because I just don't think it's worth it for people that have a day job. So thank you very much. I hope this talk's been helpful. I realize it's not something that's commonly discussed at medical and surgical conferences, but I'm sure it will be a bigger part of our lives in the coming years. So I'm open to any questions. Thank you very much.